Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Lauren Swaths, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. It is my pleasure to have you all with us today to talk about real and accessible solutions to some of the most daunting challenges facing the world. But before we get into our programming on the critical issues surrounding the climate crisis, we must acknowledge that our country is at another critical moment. Here in the US and around the world, we are all preparing to absorb the highly impactful news from Minnesota in one of the most high-profile trials we have faced as a country. Undoubtedly, we are all feeling a wide variety of reactions right now. Many of us still working through that at home and alone and trying to make sense of the world that we are living in. Today's program is not about Mr. Floyd, Mr. Chauvin, racial justice, police violence, the justice system, or the myriad issues connected to the verdict. Those are all incredibly worthy topics that this council wouldn't rush to cover without gravity and intention. I do want to thank you for tuning in today, and I do want to proceed with our program today on another kind of justice, on climate justice, to hear from activists who are also business leaders and change makers. They've given us their time, offered their expertise, and I want to honor that and honor our audience who is eager to hear from their leadership and their solutions to make the world a better place. Our speakers today come from different backgrounds, from cities on opposite sides of our huge and complex country. They're working on ways to make life better, to make people's lives and churches and communities and health and access better. So thank you for tuning into our program, perhaps, undoubtedly with racing minds, and for making space to talk about creating equitable access to renewable energy. So with that, we'll lean on the Council's 70-year legacy of creating open, nonpartisan, and civil discussions on the critical affairs affecting this world. Today, we're examining what it takes to ensure that renewable energy solutions are accessible to all people. We will explore how to ensure access for low-income and under-resourced communities to the new technologies making energy safer, available, and friendlier to the earth. For those are the very communities most often directly affected by climate change. Our speakers planned for today are not only experts and activists, but they are doing this exact work in their daily lives. I'm sure you'll have questions, and when you do, please use the Q&A feature on your menu on Zoom, and we'll get to as many of them as we can after the moderated discussion. Here at the World Affairs Council, one of our passions is creating access to world affairs, issues, and solutions for young people, the leaders who will inherit our successes and our failures. We're proud to be the world affairs education provider to over 2,500 middle and high school students each year, many of who've joined us tonight alongside our members and guests from across the country. And with that, we have a tradition of the first audience question coming from a student. So Maggie Brennan, a junior at St. Joseph's University who is studying political science and public policy, will take the mic first later on. Through our programs, Maggie mentors middle school students at St. Mary's Interparochial School to compete in a junior Model United Nations, where they are trying to solve the problems of today and tomorrow. Following Maggie's question, we'll get to as many of yours as we can. Now I'd like to talk about our panelists tonight. And unfortunately, one of our speakers, Danelle Baird, the founder of Black Power, has had a conflict that has popped up very recently, and he is not able to join us at this time. But I am still so thrilled to have Andreas Karelis with us this evening. He is the founder and executive director of Re-Volv, a nonprofit organization that empowers people around the country to help other nonprofits in their own communities go solar and raise awareness about the benefits of clean energy. He is a dedicated clean energy advocate with over 15 years of environmental and renewable energy experience. Andreas is also the author of Climate Courage: How Tackling Climate Change Can Build Community, Transform the Economy, and bridge the political divide in America. We don't need any help building the political divide. That's not what you wrote about. And you can purchase this book on the event page on the Council's website. Thank you for being with us tonight, Andreas. I'll pass the virtual microphone to you for opening remarks, and then we'll have a moderated discussion between us, followed by audience Q&A. Andreas, to you.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for having me. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Really excited to have this conversation tonight. This is an important time to be discussing this. Obviously, Earth Day is on Thursday, and there's many exciting things happening this week, both in politics and otherwise, around this acknowledgement that we all share this planet and that we all care about its future. And I think, my sort of general sort of hope for this talk is that we can really start to try and change the narrative around climate change away from the doom and gloom, away from the sort of scary and overwhelming messages that we often hear and associate with climate change, and really focus on how much momentum we have towards solutions and how quickly we're moving towards a cleaner and greener world, because that momentum and those stories are really what's going to get us there faster. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm really excited to be speaking with you all.
Great. Thanks, Andreas. So let's get started. We know that energy poverty, perhaps not a term we're all familiar with, but when we think about it, energy poverty is real and a present threat for many people around the world, in developed and underdeveloped countries as well. Specifically with green energy, the perceived and the real lack of access to renewable energy solutions is even more pronounced. This common assumption that people are even more energy poor when it comes to renewable solutions definitely leads to drastic disparities between who has, for example, a solar panel and who doesn't. And frankly, it's not just who even has the solar panel, but who dares to think that such solutions could ever apply to their own homes and buildings and communities. This line of thinking and sometimes reality leads to disparities between who has affordable heat in their homes, good indoor air quality, and even who has access to things like the internet. What do you think needs to happen to change this overall narrative and increase access to renewable energy options?
Thanks, Lauren. That's a critical question that we all have to face here in this country as well as around the world. As you know, or may know, over close to 1 billion people around the world lack access to reliable electricity. And that's energy poverty in its most stark form. Here in the United States, we know that low-income families pay a higher percentage of their salaries towards their energy bills than others due to the low income, and so energy becomes a very difficult and very important challenge that we all need to face. And what we know is that historically, particularly in the United States, as well as other parts of the world, communities of color, low-income communities, disenfranchised and marginalized communities have bore the brunt of the fossil fuel industry's pollution and toxics in their communities, right? Fracking in your backyard, chemical plants, refineries, et cetera, that cause higher rates of asthma, that cause higher rates of cancer, and on and on. Pollution that spews off the freeways that go through communities of people who don't historically have a say in making sure that their communities are not the subject of this. And so, Van Jones wrote a book called The Green Collar Economy over 10 years ago, and he pointed out that what we need to do is make sure that as the clean energy technology and all the benefits that come from that, the jobs, the cleaner air, the electricity savings, is starting to happen, that we make sure that there's not what he called eco-apartheid, meaning that the communities that have historically bore the brunt of the fossil fuel industry not only need to be included in receiving all those benefits, but really should be first in line to receive them, to benefit from what the clean energy economy has to offer. Now, how well are we doing on that front? Not well. There was a report that came out from Berkeley and Tufts in 2019. And what they found is that in predominantly African American communities, there's a 69% less chance of solar power. There is less solar in communities of color, less solar in low-income communities by far, right? And so this is something that absolutely needs to be addressed. Now, one of the solutions that was really exciting to see in that report and that we've seen in the solar industry is that what they called the seeding effect. And the seeding effect is basically, you could call it the ripple effect or the contagious effect. And what that means is that when one person goes solar, their neighbor and their neighbor are more and more likely to go solar, right? Sort of follow your neighbor's footsteps in a way. And in fact, what this study found is that seeding effect is actually even more prominent in communities of color, and that in African American communities in particular, it's almost double what it is in any other community, meaning it has that much of a bigger impact. When somebody goes solar, you're going to see that much more adoption. So those are the kinds of things that, again, I feel like in the work that we do at Re-Volv, bringing solar to nonprofits so that the nonprofit can demonstrate to the community that it's gone solar and that it's saving money, and look at the benefits that you could also receive by going solar, as well as kind of the messages in Climate Courage about highlighting the stories of these positive impacts that we're seeing in communities around the country. That these are the types of sort of ways forward. Let's look at the bright spots. Let's focus on what's working, and get more and more people to adopt it as quickly as we can.
I like that the seeding effect. So that helps us think a little bit about some solutions, which we promised that we would not just be all doom and gloom about climate change and worrying about the eco apartheid. Lots of good new vocabulary for us today, Andreas. And while there's still this misunderstanding that climate change will only become dire far into the distant future, we do know that climate change is affecting communities today, here and now, and worldwide. And as we've discussed, climate change is disproportionately impacting impoverished communities. That includes immigrant communities, communities of color, people who live on the African continent, small islands around the Asian megadeltas, and even up in the Arctic region. How can we help others around the world who might not be at the forefront of the physical impacts of climate change? How can we help them understand that it is happening today? And that's not something that we can afford to wait to worry about into the future.
Yeah. I think honestly, I think the rest of the world gets it a lot better than we do. I think that, we have seen over the years that the United States has been the laggard, right? I mean, we are the only country to have pulled out of the Paris Agreement, even though we've now, joined again. And so what that shows to the rest of the world is, that the United States has been waffling, back and forth around this issue for decades, even though we're the historically the largest emitter of in history. And it is exciting that Biden this week is bringing leaders from 40 countries to the United States to have a summit to discuss its climate commitment. But I really don't think that the issue is with the other countries. It's really here in the United States. You're seeing China, India, deploying clean energy, at sort of breakneck speed, faster than the United States, faster than many other parts of the world. Obviously, the European Union, et cetera, many places have realized that this is the wave of the future. And of course, the public around the world understands that climate change is real, is caused by humans, and let's get on with it, right? It's really only in the United States that this is even a question, that this is even a debate. But even with that being said, in the United States, it's actually much less of a debate than we realize. We often hear from the media and from politicians that it's this fiercely partisan issue, right? That Al Gore and the Democrats care about climate change, and Republicans don't. And that's totally not true. One of the findings that was really surprising and empowering for me as I was researching for the book for Climate Courage is that actually 67% of Americans understand that climate change is real and caused by humans. And actually 85% of Americans want to see 100% clean energy. Now, stop for a moment and ask yourself, how many issues do 85% of Americans agree on today, right? Like not a
Right.
lot. So it really is actually one of the few issues that there is a broad consensus among the American public. Like we get that there's a problem and we know that clean energy, going 100% clean energy is the solution, and that we can get there, that it's going to create jobs, that it's going to save money in the economy. It's going to save us on electricity bills. It's going to create better healthy air, water, soil, etc. And the fact that the Biden administration has heard the messages of the climate justice movement over the years and has incorporated a lot of this into its messaging around when Biden says, when I think about climate change, I think of jobs, right? Like that's the marrying of these two issues that we really need to be telling ourselves and telling the world, and highlighting that there is this broad consensus, because the more that we realize there's so much consensus, the faster we'll be able to sort of get on with it.
All right. So the data points in the direction of consensus. The world has reached consensus, and you're optimistic that the new administration can help pull us in that direction. That's what I'm hearing.
I hope so. I'm optimistic that the American public can rally behind what it is the administration is putting forward, right? Like the Biden administration's, $2 trillion infrastructure bill is the most significant climate change legislation we've ever seen in our lifetime. And it's going to create jobs, it's going to create savings and all these things. Now, we will see as it goes through the political process, where we end up on the other side of it. But I'm hopeful that because the American public is so supportive of, yeah, let's solve the climate crisis and go clean and create jobs and rebuild our economy, that we will get there, or at least be moving in that direction quickly.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about grassroots activism and how that can affect government decision making and who gets to participate in that process. We know that low income communities are often left out of, well, all kinds of decision making, frankly, but certainly climate decision making as well. Or at the very least, they're underrepresented within governments who are trying to address climate issues and again, all types of issues. However, with climate activism, we see that grassroots organizations, community organizations, and climate justice movements are building awareness and perhaps changing public opinion and building coalitions of leadership that are continuing to grow in their influence. And these movements are increasingly being led by people who look different, by younger people, and by Black and Indigenous and people of color. I'm thinking about the Green New Deal in particular, which would not have gathered mainstream awareness without the Sunrise Movement. Can you talk to us in your opinions about how this grassroots activism truly can ensure that marginalized communities do have a seat at the table in climate change legislation? And then on the flip side, what do these issues look like among private stakeholders, like those in venture capital, banking, and private investment, who are financing renewable energy projects? So we're looking for what does it look like when we take grassroots activism affecting policy and also the private sector and the finances that are needed to move these issues forward?
Mm. Well, I think the climate justice movement has been so successful in its organizing and in its movement building and in its messaging, that Joe Biden, who was historically not a climate hawk, by any stretch of the imagination, by the time he got the nomination and was putting forward his climate plan, he was very much adapt, and of course what we now see in the infrastructure bill is very much the points that have been put forward by the climate justice movement for years. So that in and of itself is a phenomenal win. It's a huge significant victory on behalf of everyone who has organized for years and years. Not only that, but also who the Biden administration has been putting into positions of power, right? Like all of these staff that they are putting in are longtime leaders, are longtime advocates for climate justice. So all of that is really demonstrating how successful the movement has been. And then in terms of on the financial side, we've seen investors pressuring banks to stop lending to the fossil fuel industry. The 350.org that started the divestment movement, which started with universities, college students getting their universities to divest from fossil fuels, and moving on to religious groups, pension plans, et cetera, around the world, has been so successful that there's now over $15 trillion divested from the fossil fuel industry, right? So that's the type of success that you can see with organizing. Lastly, I'll point out that the markets are demonstrating that it's working. Jim Cramer, from Mad Money, TV show has, last year basically said fossil fuel is the new tobacco. I will not invest in it. I will not recommend anybody invest in it. So not only has it become morally bankrupt, meaning, because of the youth, because of the climate justice movement saying we need to divest from this for moral reasons, that is only compounded by the fact that the fossil fuel industry has tanked, in recent years, that, the largest coal companies are going bankrupt, that the oil and gas giants, that their valuation is dropping precipitously. So it is both a movement building as well as the markets responding to that. These are liabilities, right? Nobody wants to, be building a natural gas plant in 2021 because, by 10 to 15 years from now, not only will they be out competed on a cost perspective by clean energy, but who knows what the legislation will say about being able to continue to spew fossil fuels, pollution into the atmosphere.
Right, and government regulation plays such a huge role here. And when we think about building infrastructure for renewable energy technologies, most people just assume a heavy hand in government regulation and policy. And we've talked a bit about that. We've talked about how we'll have to see how Biden's proposals work their way through Congress and public opinion, and what comes out on the other side and what gets funded. But let's dive a little bit deeper into the private sector side of this, particularly on research and development. Aren't renewables technically good for business? And shouldn't the private sector be jumping on the opportunity to get on board, regardless of grassroots activism, regardless of pressure to divest? How is the business model and financial opportunity from a pure profit standpoint driving innovation? And is that accelerating?
Oh, yes, absolutely it is. And in fact, up until November, and now what we see as really some exciting developments at the political level, the clean energy revolution has been well underway for many, many years. In the United States, last year we did not build any new fossil fuel generation facilities. Right, it's only clean energy. Right, and the vast majority of new electricity generation facilities built around the world in 2020 were all clean energy. The majority of which are solar. So that is, and that's not because of policy. That's because of economics. Of the top 6 most highly valued companies in the world, 5 of them are already 100% renewable energy powered already, right? And that's not just because their customers are demanding it, which they are, but it's because it's good for the bottom line, right? They are making an investment, in their own infrastructure, so that they know what their costs are going to look like down the road, and they're going to be continuing to save money on cheap renewable energy. One example that I like to point to is, the MGM casinos and hotels in Las Vegas. They own over a dozen of those hotels along the Strip. And a few years ago, they decided that they wanted to go solar, partly driven by their customer demand, but also because they saw, hey, we got a lot of sun out here, and we're going to make this happen. They started out by building the largest contiguous rooftop solar array in the country, and it still didn't cover all of their electricity needs. So they decided to build their own solar farm out in the desert. And in order to do so, they had to basically detach from the utility. And the utility said, well, we're going to charge you an $80 million exit fee in order to do that. And not only did they pay it, and did they went ahead and built their solar farm, but it was still economical to do so. They're still saving money on their electricity even after having to pay an $80 million exit fee. So that's the moment that we're in, that the cost of fossil fuels are only going to continue to rise as we have a smaller and smaller demand, I'm sorry, a smaller and smaller supply globally, whereas the cost of renewable energy technology are going to continue to drop. And so businesses are 100% on board. The American public is 100% on board, or 85%, I should say. And so it's really only, a handful of politicians that are basically in the pockets of the fossil fuel industry, and the media that likes to drum up the controversy, that are putting forward this narrative that it's costly or that there's any sort of debate. We are quickly moving to a 100% renewable energy powered world. The question is, how quickly can we get there, and how equitable will that transition be?
And if we continue to position the US as really far behind in that race, what is the loss for the US, in your opinion, for being so far behind?
Well, I would say, I think that the opportunity is great, right? The the solar panel was invented, in the United States, and in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, in the 1950s, right? And we have since, lost, keeping ahead of that race, because we basically were laggards in that development. The opportunity that is presented in front of us, again, very much outlined in the infrastructure bill by Joe Biden. But for example, Mark Jacobson, who's a professor of civil engineering at Stanford University, him and his team have put together a roadmap for how the United States could go 100% renewable. And when we get to 100% renewable energy, not only will we create $1 trillion worth of electricity bill savings for Americans, but we will also create a net increase of 2 million new jobs, right? So that is the opportunity that's in front of us. And we're starting to see that happen. So, the infrastructure bill, for example, has, you know, $2 trillion that it'll be investing. Much of that will be in getting us to 100% clean energy by 2035. It will be putting up electric vehicle charging stations around the country. It will be building manufacturing facilities for electric vehicles and batteries here in the United States by offering rebates to people who buy EVs made in America, right? We're already seeing it. I write about it in Climate Courage. Tesla, with their 2 gigafactories in Reno and Buffalo, are pumping out the electric vehicles and batteries that we need to power this transition, and the costs are going to continue to come down. So it is a manufacturing opportunity in terms of jobs. It's clean air. It's basically trying to catch up with the rest of the world and be a leader, which we can be, in pushing forward the clean energy revolution that's underway.
Shout out to all of our audience members in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, for inventing this right
There you
across
go.
the bridge. And the
Nice.
ENIAC by IBM was invented in Philadelphia. So we've got a little history here in our region.
Quite a bit, yes.
Andreas, in your book, Climate Courage, you talk a lot about this, about the falling costs, the increased efficiencies of all of these renewable energy technologies. Can you bring some of these technologies to life for our audience, and what makes the most sense? What do you want us to know? Is if we think, okay, renewable energies, I think of Tesla, that's a bit out of my reach. I guess I should buy something that's recycled. I think there's this huge gap from a consumer and a community perspective about what does this really mean, renewable energy, and how accessible is it to me outside of solar panels? Talk to us about the technologies that you think we should take away from this conversation. What are the hurdles and opportunities for us as community members?
Yeah, no, 100%. And there are a couple, interesting things to touch on there. I mean, first of all, the technology is changing and evolving and getting so much cheaper, you know, at breakneck speed. So when I started Re-Volv 10 years ago, the cost of solar panels were 90% more expensive than they are today. The cost has dropped 90% in the last 10 years. In terms of jobs that clean energy creates, that solar energy creates, the solar industry is growing the number of jobs of people employed in solar at 14 times the national average. The number of people who work in solar today uh, is actually twice as many people that work in the entire fossil fuel industry working in electricity generation, right? And solar is only covering 2% of the country's electricity usage. So when we get up to 20%, 30%, 40% of our country being powered with solar and wind and other clean energy, think about how many jobs that creates. So those are really some of the big takeaways that, the sort of narrative that we've been told is it's the economy or the environment, and that's totally not true. It's quite the opposite. Clean energy is the fastest growing job sector, and so it does create wealth, it does create benefits for people in our communities that those jobs can't be outsourced. You have someone getting on the roof, installing solar, someone weatherizing and providing energy efficiency in buildings. Those are things that are going to stay here. To the other aspect of your question, how does it relate to us in our day-to-day lives? What is it that we can do? I think that we see, well, first of all, there is always the uh, voting with your dollar, right? And we are starting to see that companies have responded to that. So, for example, GM, right, has announced that they're going to only produce electric vehicles by 2035. Which the state of California, saying we're also going to require, sale of only electric vehicles by 2035. State of Washington is saying by 2030 we will be, all electric. So that's happening faster and faster. And again, that was largely driven by consumer demand for electric vehicles, and showing what's possible. But I think in general, there's a broader issue here that I really feel is important to talk about, and it's really the crux of the book of Climate Courage, which is that so far, for the past 30 plus years that we've known about climate change and that we hear about it from the movement and folks who are trying to get us to take action, we tend to hear of solutions in two buckets. There's here's what you can do as an individual, right? So drive less, put air in your tires, change your light bulbs, use a reusable straw, right? Eat lower on the food chain, etc. And those are all super, super important, and we all should do them because they do demonstrate to our community our values, and it does drive sort of changes in sort of consumer behavior based on the more people that vote with their dollar. So that is important, but it's not going to cut it, right? And
Right.
in many ways, the fossil fuel industry is actually responsible. In fact, the term carbon footprint was originally coined by Shell in an advertising campaign that they put out to try and basically turn us away from the blame on the fossil fuel industry to say, oh, it's you as consumers who should be
Oh,
tasked with solving this. So while our individual actions are important, they're not enough. And the opposite sort of side of the spectrum is what we've often heard is uh, vote for the climate friendly politician every 4 years, and write a letter to your senator and call your congressperson, and hopefully the federal government will change and make something happen. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the call, we actually are seeing, the most significant climate legislation in front of us right now, which is really exciting, and we are hopeful that passes. And we do need to put political pressure on that. But for the past, however many years, it's been my belief that, well, as much as I'm going to go to marches and try to be involved in the political process, I'm not holding my breath for the federal government to solve this problem. So if we really know that we can't solve it as an individual in my own home, and we're not going to hold our breath waiting for the federal government to solve it, where can we interact? Where can we create a real impact? And that's at the community level, because at the community level, we can work with our neighbors, we can create sort of scalable solutions that can actually demonstrate the benefits of clean energy and climate solutions. And we can tell stories, which then can reach the next community and the next community and so on and so forth. We have, at the end of the day, people need to feel that they can take an action and have an impact and see that impact is benefiting them, and it had a real tangible impact on the climate. Because if they don't see that what they can do is going to make a difference, then they tend to disengage from the issue. So we have to be thinking about, at our community level, what can we do with our workplace, with our neighborhood, with our children's school, with our family, and those in our community. Those are really the areas that I think we can be stepping up as citizens.
Thanks, Andreas. You set up your colleague here, Donnell Baird, who's been able to join us a bit late, but we're so happy you're here. It was a perfect time to bring you in, Donnell, in terms of community impact. For our audience, I'll give you a brief introduction. Donnell is the founder of Block Power, which is a Brooklyn-based climate technology startup that retrofits buildings in underserved communities with clean energy heating and cooling systems. Donnell spent 4 years as a political and community organizer and more than 2 years managing a national initiative to leverage the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act energy efficiency investments in underserved communities. So his company in the private sector that he founded is doing exactly what you're talking about. You guys come at this in different ways that are quite complementary, which is why we're excited you could join us. Donnell, I'd love to give you a moment to tell our audience a little bit about what your company does and how you are going about improving communities and making renewable energy solutions accessible to communities. Welcome.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Glad to be here. At Block Power, we focus on analyzing and financing and installing energy efficiency and clean energy, and increasingly building electrification technologies that allow us to shift buildings entirely off of fossil fuels. A simple way to understand it is that we're trying to turn the building into a Tesla. And what we mean by that is, if Tesla is taking the fossil fuel engine out of the automobile and replacing it with a smart, software-enabled, internet-connected, 100% electric engine to drive that car, we want to do the same thing for heating and air conditioning and hot water systems in buildings. And so we replace the fossil fuel equipment in buildings with all electric, smart, software-enabled equipment. And that allows us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by as high as 70% reductions, while saving individual buildings money by decreasing their energy costs. And so we have worked for a while to come up with a solution that allows us to analyze and finance clean energy upgrades in urban buildings and low-income rural buildings and suburban buildings. And we're hopeful that this can be an input along the path to reducing the 30% of greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted by the building sector in America.
30%. Well, we're glad you're doing this work. I know our audience has a lot of questions for you all, so we'll move into that portion of our programming. And as is our tradition here, we have a student ask the first question. We know students are passionate about the climate crisis and solutions. So we've got Maggie Brennan here with us. She's a student at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. Maggie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lauren. I grew up under the impression that solar panels were sort of a symbol of wealth, and I've been surprised to learn how much money it really saves in the long run, along with helping the climate crisis. So I was wondering how we can educate Americans about the investment into solar power, saving them on energy bills in the long run.
Donnell, you want to go first? I feel like I've been talking a lot here, so I'm going to give you the
Sure,
mic.
sure. I'll be your late inning pitching. So like the Phillies. So, solar panels used to be expensive, right? I mean, even in my lifetime, when I was 15, 16 years old, solar panels are pretty expensive. And the Obama administration actually invested, billions of dollars in solar panel technology. And some of that helped to lower the cost of solar panels to where now the cost of installing them can help most building owners save a bunch of money. And I do think that clean energy as a whole, it's unfortunate that we've allowed customers to rightly or wrongly associate clean energy with affluence. We want clean energy to be for everybody. That's the only way for clean energy to work. That's the only way to save this planet, is for clean energy to be for everybody, not only here in America, but for, you know, the family in living in tough conditions in Bangladesh. We need clean energy for all. And part of what we have to do is to make sure that as we produce and finance and install clean energy systems, that we are providing it in a format and at a price point that is affordable for everyone. And then once we do that, we do have to do the marketing, and we do need to get the celebrities and the influencers and Kim Kardashian and her sisters to talk about how great solar panels is. Just like any other business, we need to be heavily and deeply engaged in educating buildings across America that clean energy saves money and creates jobs.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. And I would, add that, what the work that Re-Volv does is really very much focused on exactly what Donnell described. What we do is finance solar for nonprofit organizations that otherwise have a hard time getting financing for solar. And these are nonprofits that serve the members of their community. These are homeless shelters, they're multifamily affordable housing units, they're food banks and health clinics, and places where people really rely on, especially during these difficult times. And so by those organizations going solar and saving money on their electricity bills so that they can provide more services to their community, we do a job of trying to tell a story, right? We usually make videos and have events and do social media and get the story in the press and really try to raise awareness at the community level of, look at, the school that went solar and now look at how they're benefiting the community, through that savings. And our theory of change at Re-Volv is the more nonprofits and the more stories like that we can tell, the more it'll sort of resonate with people, and we can kind of help change that narrative.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Maggie. We've got another audience question from Andy. Andy writes, do some people not believe in climate change because they somehow feel threatened by the idea of climate change? And if you think that they feel threatened, what are those threats? And what might take those threats away?
So I spent, part of the reason why I was behind, I spent 4 hours today testifying in Congress, which I don't know if it sounds cool. It was not cool. It was not cool. And there are a bunch of Republican congressmen and women who were really concerned about a lot of the clean energy legislation that the Biden-Harris White House and Democrats in Congress have proposed. I 100% support the clean energy legislation, but I got to spend 4 hours today listening to arguments from the other side of the aisle, which I admit I don't spend a lot of time doing that. And I should spend more time listening and trying to understand the answer to your question. There are trillion-dollar industries, tied up in fossil fuels. And anytime you have that amount of money and profits to be made, I think there are some scientific studies that the more emotionally anchored or psychologically committed someone is to a position, particularly when they're being paid, if they get salary or they own a business or they're making profits from fossil fuels, it's like almost biologically impossible to persuade them of facts going in the other direction. So it takes a lot of work to persuade folks, particularly those who have jobs or have built wealth in the fossil fuel economy, to that they must make a change, because they genuinely, in many cases, in their heart of hearts, believe that what they are doing to provide consistent energy and stable energy, and that clean energy isn't ready for prime time because the solar panels will need to be replaced, or they only work during the day, or that windmills freeze during the winter. You know, a lot of these folks genuinely believe some of the concerns and criticisms that they hear about clean energy. And so sometimes it's not about persuading people. Sometimes it's just a question of raw political power and who has power and who doesn't. Thank goodness for those of us that are alarmed about climate change, we now have an opportunity to push our agenda forward to introduce clean energy at scale across America. And that's exactly what we intend to do.
Yeah, 100% agree. And you know, the only thing I would add is, yeah, this is, you know, a big topic in climate courage. And you know, one of the studies that I found that was really telling for me was came out of George Mason, and basically what they said is, when you presented climate change to an audience and didn't, you know, and showed how scary it was and how you know, bad it could be, but did not show the solutions and did not show how they could play a role in those solutions, meaning they didn't feel that they had any agency, as opposed to people where they said, this is climate change and this is how you can play a role in solving it. The former group actually, you know, disbelieved the problem altogether, right? So if you are told that there's a problem and there's nothing you can do about it, your brain psychologically actually wants to, you know, not only tune it out, but just sort of not even believe that it's real. So, well, I don't believe that. You know, it's, you know, I in the book I say, it's akin to if you break your arm and the doctor says, well, you know, you broke your arm, you have to wear a cast all summer, and you think, well, I don't want to wear a cast all summer. I'm not even going to believe you that my arm is broken, right? Like that's psychologically what's happening with a lot of folks. And so that's why it's so important, you know, understanding how the human mind works and realizing that we have to pair not only when we're raising awareness about the problem, we have to raise awareness about the solutions and the benefits that come with that, because that empowering message is going to get more people to accept the science.
I want to build on this idea for a minute. There's some folks out there who are saying the global catastrophe of COVID, of the pandemic, and seeing how it became global very quickly. Borders, rules, legislators couldn't stop it, and that the solutions also have to be globally connected. It's been a terrifying experience. It still is for all of us around the world. But being forced into that, shoved into this global challenge that seems so big, many people disbelieved it. Does that give us a model or some room to stretch in terms of tackling a problem that seems even bigger, which is climate change? Do we have a little bit of muscle built up from pandemic management that we can borrow into feeling like climate management might be a little bit more realistic?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, Danielle, if you want to go first, but honestly, in my opinion, I think if anything, the way that particularly the United States handled COVID is a warning for the climate crisis. I mean, we saw that we were not able to mobilize quickly. We were not able to deploy resources to those who needed it, who were on the front lines, who were being affected by this. You know, and also that because of the polarizing nature of our media and the way the messaging came out around it, that you had people who wouldn't even take the most simple precautions to stop the spread and or protect themselves, right? So I think that in my opinion, how poorly we've handled COVID, you know, hundreds of thousands of deaths that did not need to happen, you know, with simple precautions were taken. It's really only a warning of what is to come. I mean, climate change is going to be drastically more impactful in very negative way. I mean, we're already seeing it, right? Every year, California's fires are worse and worse. The floods slamming into the Gulf Coast are worse and worse. Texas freezing over, right? I mean, these are the kinds of things we're going to continue to see. And it, at least in my, you know, perspective, we did not handle COVID well at all. And unless we figure out how do we mobilize, you know, our society quickly to solve these things, that we are headed for a much scarier reality as the effects of climate change continue to unfold.
Donnell?
Yeah, I agree completely. I think that if you think about the pandemic as a fire drill, think we get an F. I mean, I think we're clearly not ready for serious society-wide calamity. That is 100% what climate change is and will continue to be. It is already occurring at society scale in places like Syria, where a civil war erupted due to climate change. Mali, droughts, same thing. The state of California is burning down literally every year. I talk to some of my friends who work in the utility companies. They have no plan. They have no solution. The state's just going to burn, right? Their solution is, well, are there flame retardant materials that we can offer homeowners across California, because there just will be climate-induced wildfires every year, multiple times a year. So the best thing we can do is just start selling people flame-resistant material for their homes, right? That's where we are, and it's only going to get worse and worse. And I'm preaching to the choir. You all know all of this. I think that the pandemic is a wake-up call. And when I talk to leaders in the corporate sector, even at some of the big tech companies, I'm encouraged because I think they get it, that they're starting to understand. And I think we're all starting to understand that the pandemic is just a little glimpse it's a little premonition of the very beginning of how terrible things can start to get. Once the climate stuff runs off the rails. We are starting to see a few, I'm not going to say they're saying it publicly, although some of them are, but some of the business leaders and technology leaders and folks that I talk to in Silicon Valley and on Wall Street or at the Federal Reserve banking system, they are having very, very serious conversations around what will it take to prevent the climate collapse. And I think that the pandemic has helped to make that real for lots and lots of people across our society, which is good.
Yeah, it's certainly woken up a lot of people to a lot of different things, and a calamity of the scale of the pandemic has to shift everybody's thinking. And we've had a lot of time to think about things and research and read and try and figure it out as we've all been at home for a year plus now. We've got a time for one more question. Larry asks, is there a shortage of raw materials for solar panels for making them? How much energy is used in manufacturing them? And does that energy for manufacturing renewable energy solutions come from a renewable source? Can you talk, I'm not sure which one of you has more expertise in this, but the supply chain and the production chain for renewable energy infrastructure, is that green as well? Or do we need to look at that too?
Yeah, I think I think whenever I get that question all the time, and one thing I would say is there are materials that are rare that are used in solar that are also used in cell phones and laptops and televisions and everything that we use, right? So, to the degree that we're going to single out solar panels and be like, well, is this sustainable that we have to, mine for, this or that? But in general, one of the main components of solar panels is silicon, which is the most abundant element on the planet. It's everywhere. So I don't think that we are, facing a shortage per se of that. Obviously, there is a question around recycling those materials, as those panels reach their life. The truth is we haven't really had to figure that out yet because the panels that first started going up in the 70s are still up and producing power. So, but as we see, panels, first generation panels needing to come down, I'm confident that there will be, industries that build up around recycling those materials. And this, in terms of the energy that is required, I think at this point it's under 2 years of a solar panel's life. Where it will have created more energy than it took to produce the panel, and then the panel will continue to produce free, clean electricity for the next 30 to 40 years. So the ROI and from an energy perspective is is incredible, and also we're starting to see for example, as I mentioned earlier, GM is now, committed to, 100% electric vehicles by 2035. That's all, and as is California and Washington State is 2030. And that's in line with the fact that the Biden infrastructure plan is going to be shooting to achieve 100% clean energy nationwide by 2035. So by 2035, all our cars will be electric, running on 100% clean energy. And honestly, it could even happen faster than that, right? So that is very much where we're going. So I think that's a great question, but I think we're moving in the right direction on it.
Yeah, it is a great question. I would just add quickly that, yeah, I mean, I think there are rare earth materials involved in solar and battery. You know, some of the refrigerants and heat pumps, which we're a huge proponent of, have, you know, chlorofluorocarbons. There's a lot of research and development that's going into, for example, capturing carbon and using it as a refrigerant to replace some of the greenhouse gas emitting refrigerants that, if they leak out of the heat pump, can cause challenges. But I agree, we're headed in the right direction. There needs to be more research. I also want to call out that some of the labor standards, I mean, there's concerns around children in the Congo, you know, mining for cobalt and stuff like that. And so Amnesty International has published a set of principles in February that they want to see people in all industries adhere to. But I'm sure we all have full confidence that the people in the solar industry are going to be the very first people to make sure that we're in compliance, right? Because we're the people who are trying to build a better world. And so directionally, I think we're headed into the right direction. It's a good question.
Thank you both for that. We are at time. These conversations always go so quickly, and I appreciate helping us end on a positive note with such a complex and what can feel like such a heavy subject. Andreas and Donnell, thank you for your time and sharing your expertise with us and the different way that you're approaching climate and renewable energy in all different types of communities. We're a really diverse place here in Philly, as you know, and so we appreciate being able to bring your diverse perspectives to our audience tonight. And to our audience and members and guests and new friends, thanks for spending the last hour with us. We have a wide variety of upcoming program on all different things, future of cities, wine tasting from Chile coming up, and many more programs that you can all find on our website, wacphila.org. Thank you for your time and sharing your ideas with us tonight. Good evening.
Thank you. Good evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.